Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work we've done in terms of looking at the environmental sustainability. So all of us as consumers, regardless of what we do in our profession, make decisions about food every day. And those decisions are based around taste, they're based around nutritional value, they're certainly based around cost, food safety, the source or country of origin, or even in more closer distances, local, and then of course environmental sustainability. And so the question that runs through our minds is, what is environmental sustainability? And what is an environmental footprint? An environmental footprint really examines many different aspects of the environment. Could include things like greenhouse gases. It could include nutrient cycling. It could include water use and water quality, air quality for ammonia emissions, for example. And those are areas which we will often see in the published literature. And I'm going to share with you today some of the work that we've done to address those areas. However, they are not a complete picture. As researchers, we've started down this path because these are the easy or easier areas to measure. And the more difficult areas to measure include things like carbon storage and biodiversity. And those aspects of all production systems, whether livestock or crop farming, are very difficult to get a handle on. And the other important aspect is farming is really management of an agro-ecosystem. It's not cookie cutter. Every farm has different natural resources that they're dealing with, and therefore these kinds of assessments are challenging. And so as Bob has already mentioned, Bob is a cow-calf producer. That part of that sector of the industry has cows on farms that typically have a calf every year. Those calves can go back into the herd as replacement females, or they can go into backgrounding operations and then finally into finishing. Throughout that whole entire production chain, we use forages as part of that feeding. And where we introduce typically the higher grain, the high energy density, that's the important part of that feeding system, is at the end, at the final phase of that animal's life. People are often surprised to know that here in Canada, because we often see global statistics, but here in Canada, the average beef cow herd is approximately 69 head, and about 39% of beef farms have less than 47 animals on them. That's not to say that we don't have larger, higher animal density feedlots, but if we look at the cow sector, that's what the profile looks like. 1/3 of all ag land in Canada is pasture, much of which is not suited for crop production. And also in Canada, more than 80% of what cattle eat in their entire lifetime is forage-based. And this is not different from a global perspective either. Globally, 57% of the land used for feed production is not suitable for crop production, and 85% of global livestock dry matter is materials that are not currently edible for humans. So what is the unique feature of ruminant animals, so that includes cattle, that includes bison, sheep, and goats, that allows them to take these low-quality forages that they're grazing, sometimes higher quality forages, but allows them to turn that forage into high energy or high nutrient density food. And that's the unique feature of a rumen. So that rumen contains billions of microorganisms that have the capability to break down that fibrous feed, and it actually is converted into microbial protein that the animals then use as a source of protein. As a consequence of this breakdown of feed, we actually have methane as a byproduct. That's where methane comes from. Methane comes from the front end of animals, not the back end of animals, as many people think. And here's something that many people don't think about as well, is that in the process of the breakdown of that feed, when we have methane reduced, that methane is actually an energy loss. So as a producer, you are obviously thinking about methane production because it's a loss of feed energy. So if we said that 10% of all energy that an animal eats is lost as methane, it's an energy loss that would otherwise be converted to milk or meat production. So it's like saying to a producer, go and burn every 1 in 10 of your round bales. So obviously there's clearly an incentive to be able to reduce methane and divert more of that energy to milk and meat production. In agriculture, as I said, we produce 8%, but that doesn't mean that we don't want to get better and that we don't want to produce less. So the three primary greenhouse gases are methane, nitrous oxide, and carbon dioxide. We already talked about where, when we have nitrogen loss to the environment, we have nitrous oxide production, and that's in the form of, from either manure application or commercial fertilizers, and then certainly in terms of stored manure, and then certainly in terms of cattle, that's where the primary source of methane is from, and also from manure as well. Here's what Canadian ag emissions look like. So this is focusing only now on agriculture. Here's how Canada figures in the total global picture in terms of greenhouse gases. We produce approximately 1.6% of global emissions, and in terms of Canadian agriculture specifically, it's about 0.11% of global emissions. And again, that's not to say in Canada that we shouldn't strive to do better. Grasslands comprise about 70% of the world's agricultural land, and these grasslands are important. Because plants actually take CO2 from the environment, those grasslands are an important sink of carbon. Unfortunately, though, grassland acres in Canada and in the US are decreasing. So now what's the work that we have done? In conjunction with colleagues from the University of Manitoba and colleagues from across Canada, we've compared the beef industry over a 30-year time frame. And we've asked the question about what do greenhouse gases look like? What about the number of animals and the land required to produce the same amount of beef? What about ammonia emissions, and what about water use? It's important as scientists that we publish the work that we do. So this is one of the publications, and as I said, this is the number of authors that were involved in that publication. And so we took information and we considered cattle production systems across Canada. And as I said, those are regionally very diverse and require the ability to be able to look at different feedstuffs that are used in different parts of the country. And we looked at the greenhouse gas emissions using a life cycle assessment primarily based on a Canadian model called HOLIS. A life cycle assessment typically means that you look at the inputs to that system. So in this case, it includes fertilizers, pesticides, any machinery, calves, animals that are coming out of the system. We look at it for both feed and we look at it for animals, and then we look at the outputs. So on the top you have the greenhouse gases, and then we also obviously have the commodity, which is beef. So what did we find? We found that to produce the same amount of beef as we produced 30 years ago, we needed 29% fewer cattle in the breeding herd, that's the cow herd, and 27% finished fewer cattle are required to produce the same amount of beef. It required 24% less land, and that our carbon footprint is actually 15% smaller than it was 30 years ago. The next that we looked at was ammonia emissions. And the same thing, we used the same life cycle assessment that I talked about before. And what did we find here? We found that in that 30-year time frame, we've actually decreased ammonia emissions per kilogram of beef by approximately 20%. Finally, the last area that we looked at was water use. Most people think that water use associated with beef cattle production comes primarily from the animals drinking the water, and in fact, the greatest amount of water used comes from producing the feed that is associated with production of those animals, and water intake is less, and actually beef processing accounts for very little of that. Overall, we've realized in that 30-year time frame about a 17% reduction in water use intensity. That means the water that we use to produce every kilogram of beef. And so you might ask, how is it that in that 30-year time frame, those reductions occurred? And they occurred primarily because we've improved the reproductive efficiency. And what does that mean? That means if a cow is able to drop a calf every year, the emissions associated with that herd are associated with all the animals in the herd, including and all of those animals that produce a kilogram of beef. So in countries in the world where you don't have animals that are having a calf every year, where their reproductive efficiency is very low, it means you have a lot of greenhouse gases produced and not much output coming out of it. And that's what makes the environmental footprint look much bigger. The challenging part, which we're now embarking on, is looking at the other attributes of those production systems which are extremely important. And that includes our ability to support grasslands, which support biodiversity, as well as the value of all these thousands of acres of pasture in terms of sequestering carbon. So taking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing it in that root mass that's below the soil. 1 in 3 calories globally is wasted. And I think that's an important contribution that we can all make in terms of reducing emissions. I'm going to share some work with you now that looked at, it was some US data that looked at shifting land from animals to crops and the environmental sustainability, food security, and nutritional adequacy. And this is stepping now into that next dimension beyond, looking at nutrients per kilogram of, looking at emissions per kilogram of nutrients and thinking about diet as a whole. Because that's the important part when we make recommendations about diet, is to make sure that those diets are cost effective, they're culturally appropriate, and of course that they provide nutritional adequacy. So in this study, and we are now embarking upon similar work in Canada, but in this study, again, published literature so that we can ensure that it's peer-reviewed and scrutinized by other independent teams of scientists. Here's what this work showed, that animal-derived foods provide, at present, about 24% of energy, 48% of protein, and then the range, depending on the food products, how they were put together and how the diets were put together, a significant portion of essential fatty acids and essential amino acids. And again, this was a study that was conducted in the US. Livestock recycle a tremendous amount of human and edible food and byproducts that go into animal diets. And if they weren't placed into animal diets, they would have to be removed from the system in another way at an energetic cost. Obviously, we know the importance in terms of employment and exports. And here's the interesting thing is that those diets that were formulated in plants-only systems, actually, when you looked at the value of those diets, there was a greater excess of dietary energy and a greater number of nutrient deficiencies. Further, they reduced total emissions, total greenhouse gas emissions by 2.6%. So I think it's important when we think about livestock and crop production systems that we acknowledge them as being part of a system. So if we look at this diagram, we can see that manure that cattle produce form an important part of improving soil fertility, but also soil organic matter. That manure, as we talked about, can be moved into biorefinery to produce bioenergy, as can dead stock. Certainly that manure, as we just said, has a role in soil and improving soil quality, under which we grow those crops, and those crops go back into animals. And so you can see in this circular economy, there is tremendous value at each stage. So in conclusion, I would like to leave you with a few last thoughts. I think we can all agree that there's a need to be able to not only undertake science and science studies, but to be able to find a strategy by which we can communicate that effectively to the general public. As scientists, we like to tell very complex stories. We'd like to make them very long and lengthy, and we're not very good at communicating with the general public for the most part. Let's find our shared values. We all have an interest in environmental sustainability, and how can we use those shared values to communicate science more effectively?